Hey there, listener. You have clicked on another episode of the spin-off show with the Jock, also known as Anthony from the Jock and Nerd podcast. On this particular episode, I got on a guy that I've been wanting to have on for a bit. His name's August Ragone. August Ragone is the man when it comes to Godzilla and kaiju and Japanese sci-fi horror knowledge. This guy knows his shit. He is the two-time Rondo award-winning author of the highly regarded E.G. Tsuburaya, Master of Monsters, which is still available out on Amazon, so you can definitely check that out if you're interested in the why and the how of how these monster movies were made, and all by this one guy. We talk about the history of Japanese kaiju horror filmmaking, especially in like the 40s, 50s, 60s. We also get into a little bit of the American perspective on horror and sci-fi filmmaking and how they purchased a lot of these Japanese films and then repurposed them for American audiences. We get into the current state of films. We get his thoughts on Avengers Endgame, Godzilla, King of the Monsters, a little bit of Star Wars talk. Suffice to say, this man knows a lot about a lot of random things. We even get into the history of horror hosts on TV and random other stuff. He can go. He can talk. I let him do it. Now you're going to check it out. This is the Jock Spin-Off Show. And August, thanks for being flexible with me and setting up a time to chat here Monday
thanks,
evening.
Anthony. Yeah, no problem.
So I've been wanting to talk to you for a bit because, first off, John Bellotti Jr., who you might know, hyped you up as a guy to talk to, and we've been trying to. Me and Imran have been trying to figure out a way to get you on Jock and Nerd, but I feel like this is actually a better avenue because Imran loves to talk, and I think you like to talk as well. And I think me and you, I think just us two is better than three or a foursome.
Right.
So.
Right. Well, but, I get. Sometimes I can be wound up to be sort of the Kevin Smith of Japanese nerd shit. So,
how would you describe yourself, August? I know you're the award-winning writer of that book about E.G. Tsuburaya.
I'm a useless loser.
But other than that, what else you got?
I'm just totally useless. I got a bunch of junk in my head that I've been collecting since I was a kid, which is totally useless unless you're into what I'm into.
And what are you into again?
Oh, man. I grew up with things like The Outer Limits and horror movies on TV and going to theaters, as long as I can remember. Dragged in with my parents. Everything kind of gravitated towards, like most boys. And I'm glad to see girls are letting, because parents don't let girls play with a lot of boy things. So I think it's just sort of universally an interest in children to gravitate towards things like dinosaurs at some point. If they're interested in animals, then they see dinosaurs and they're like, oh my God. So I went through that cycle, spaceships and dinosaurs. Wasn't there a Hernandez Brothers comic book besides Love and Rockets that had, or am I thinking about Cadillacs and dinosaurs? But anyway, you kind of gravitate towards that stuff, and then I started watching. Then I just noticed Japanese monster movies, and I became especially attracted to them for some reason. I have memories going back as far as being 3 years old, like seeing Mothra, the 1961 original on television.
The OG Mothra?
Oh, yeah. Seeing that on television at like 3 years old or 4 years old. Must have been 3, if I got my time framing right. I kind of denote in my periods of my life by where I lived, what houses we were in, and I get a pretty good, bearing on that from just that. So, and I sort of just started strangely being drawn more towards the Japanese monster movies, and it wasn't an intellectual choice. And I can't really quantify what drew me. And And I just started seeing more of them, and I preferred them. And then as I got older, when I realized that these are movies made in a country called Japan, then I started categorizing them and looking specifically for them and more of them. And the offshoot of that was an obsession with Japanese culture and everything Japanese.
So you've basically become an American Japanese person?
I'm just a weirdo, that's all.
Or just a weirdo?
Just a serious weirdo, but there's a lot of other weirdos like me, so I don't feel so bad now. But
it's not. It's almost like more acceptable now with the rise of the superheroes and all that stuff. Like being weird is kind of accepted,
right? And it's become what it is, and we'll see how long that carries over. In future with the culture, because these things change. Because there were times like in the 50s. Where there were science fiction films that were released that had big ballyhoo. And that means where, they were the whole giant theater, like, the old big theaters would have the entire front of the theater, not only the marquee, but the entire facade of the theater, like decorated with giant cutout billboards, things like Day the Earth Stood Still, where you could see it in New York, one of the theaters on 42nd Street in 1950, 51, you could see that marquee from like blocks away. You could see Michael Rennie and Gort and Peggy Neal, or Patricia Neal rather, blocks away. And then that stopped. That cycle ran out because you had the big ballyhoos for movies like Day the Earth Stood Still, War of the Worlds in 53. And then there were the cheapies, the movies that were cranked out. The Universal Pictures did a lot of those, and Universal was sort of the redheaded stepchild of the motion picture studios in those days, of the big like MGM, Paramount, and so on.
What years was this?
That was like pretty much since Universal's inception.
Okay. Oh wow.
Universal was considered sort of like the redheaded stepchild for a long time, and the company was always on the verge of bankruptcy.
Even with their like movie monsters and all that stuff?
Yeah.
Or was that,
after the 40s, they almost went bankrupt every couple of years. For an example, and horror movies kept saving Universal.
Right.
And it was, Universal picked up, Horror of Dracula from Hammer and Curse of Frankenstein. And, they released Curse of Frankenstein first. And then Horror of Dracula, I think the following year. And both of those movies, like, especially Horror of Dracula, like, saved Universal. Because it made so much bleeding money. And then a couple of years later, Universal again is, like, kind of teeter-tottering. And then they release, in 1963, they released King Kong versus Godzilla, which was the big hit of the summer of 63. And
that came out through Universal?
Yeah. And saved Universal again. So, Universal was always kind of like the laughing stock of the other studios. MGM did big giant productions. You had Paramount, and 20th Century Fox, and they all kind of just chuckled at Universal. Universal was the guy that got kicked around by them. And in hindsight, looking back at those films, growing up watching monster movies on TV, the Universal horror films were great. And they're considered, benchmark classics, the films from the 30s to the 40s. And, and then you have to kind of like dovetail the Creature from the Black Lagoon in there from 54. But Universal was kind of like kicked around a little bit. But people, audiences love their movies, but the other studios kind of look down at them. I think it was sort of like,
no idea.
I think the descending order was sort of like, it was MGM, I think it was MGM, 20th Century Fox, Paramount. Someone will probably like complain and correct me, but no, that's what I want, a correction. I want the facts. That's what I'm a big proponent of. Give me the factual information. And, I learned something today, instead of going like, oh, you can't tell me that. Let me look that up on Wikipedia and I'm going to challenge you online.
Right.
And then you had like, then you had like Columbia Pictures, and then you had Universal, and Columbia kind of got, kicked around a little bit. But Columbia was still a more stable studio than Universal.
No kidding.
And then you had all the other guys, and then you had all the other guys after that. You had like all the really the cloak and dagger companies, PRC and so on, that made the really, really low budget movies for public studios. RKO was somewhere in the middle there,
King Kong.
Yeah.
RKO, right?
But, they went bankrupt by the late 50s. They just were like...
Yeah, they're gone.
Just couldn't cut it anymore. In fact, dovetailing a Japanese thing in here, is, MGM was supposed to... not MGM, I'm sorry, but RKO picked up The Mysterians from 1957. And we're going to release it in the United States. And usually when those things were picked up by an American company, the Japanese films, they were released within a year or so of their Japanese release, or whenever they were made available. And the film didn't open in the States until 1959. It was like 2 years after it was made. It was because it was picked up by RKO. RKO had it dubbed, did a, engineered an ad campaign, but they couldn't release it. They had so little left that they couldn't even release the film. And that was picked up by MGM. Mm-hmm. And MGM just took the same ad campaign and just pasted MGM over the RKO stuff. In fact, you can still find, if you're a collector of movie posters and that kind of movie memorabilia, press kits and stuff like that, there are like two distinct press kits for the Mysterians, which are the same, pretty much the same exact press kit, or press book, rather, that just has MGM Presents instead of RKO Presents. One has RKO Presents, the other has MGM Presents.
No kidding.
So those have been floating around. I found those when I was a teenager and went, oh, and I guess RKO was supposed to release this, and MGM actually were the ones who actually released it.
Mysterians is one of the movies I actually have never seen as far as kaiju or Japanese monster movies ever released here. I've seen Godzilla, Rodan, Mothra, Varan, but Mysterians never got around to Mysterians. Right.
Well, when that was released in the States, it became a huge hit in the New York area, because that's where it was. They used to release films by region first, and a lot of films would be open. They didn't do 1,400 theaters nationwide all on the same day. That rarely happened. Films would open by region.
Why was that?
And then move across the country. That's to save money. Okay. They didn't have to make as many prints. And those prints could do what they called a road show, which same print traveled around the country. So you didn't strike prints for every single theater that were booking that film. Mm-hmm. So the prints would travel, hence road show.
Got it. That makes sense.
And so when it opened up, I think Mysterians opened up at Lowe's on 42nd, and they said it was busting all the records. In fact, it's in a copy of Box Office Magazine from 1959 that I could look up for you if you want. That has like the box office numbers and how well it was doing. It was a full page place ad saying, basically in a trade magazine, a motion picture exhibitor, which is a movie that would be a movie theater owner, magazine that say, you really need this film. It's Boppo box office. Look how much it did in New York. It's going to kill when you open it up in your theater. Mm-hmm. And that's the way they used to sell these films. Not just any film, pretty much. Mm-hmm. And so when Mysterians opened up, it was a big hit. Now, it was you've read about it, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. So, it's an alien invasion movie. And, like a lot of the films that were coming out in the 50s, with the exceptions of things like, This Island Earth, or The War of the Worlds, or Day the Earth Stood Still, a couple other flicks, most of them were very low-budget affairs. Maybe you got to see a flying saucer. Maybe the flying saucer wasn't that cool looking when you finally got the movie, or the alien, was really kind of funky looking. Mm-hmm. The movies were... I'm sorry?
I said maybe a little disappointing in terms of
disappointing. Maybe, the films were in black and white, even though there's exceptional ones like Day the Earth Stood Still. Ray Harryhausen did the effects for that.
Keanu Reeves. No.
Oh, did I just say the wrong title? Did I say Earth versus the Flying Saucers?
No, you didn't. You didn't.
Yeah, okay. See, I said that, and I said something wrong. But unlike Kevin Smith, I'm not stoned, so I don't have that excuse.
So you have no good excuse. Okay,
no,
there you
I
go.
have no good excuse. Anyway, so this was a full color widescreen movie, and widescreen CinemaScope movies were the big thing in the 50s to try to get people away from their television sets, because Hollywood was having a problem. Because most movies were shot what they called Academy ratio, which is more or less a square picture, which is pretty much your picture tube on your TV. So they said, well, how can we get more people? Let's figure out ways, even though they've experimented with Technicolor as far back as the 20s, and they were trying to do widescreen pictures earlier, as well. In the 30s, they just, couldn't develop something that was viable at the time. Anyway, so they come out, they started doing things in Technicolor. They try to make the color look even more saturated than natural life. So it would just like assault your eyes when you're in a movie house. And then making these movies panoramic in widescreen was something you couldn't get on television. It's something that we kind of take for granted today with widescreen televisions and HD and, 4K and all that stuff. But back in the 50s, you had a little box with a screen that was maybe about 10 inches,
Right.
And your reception depended on, which way you pointed your antenna and how far away the broadcast station was. So, your picture could be iffy sometimes. But it was hard to get people out of their living rooms. So that that was killing movies at the time. So they developed these systems. So in Japan, Toho followed suit. They wanted to do widescreen because that's what America was doing. And Toho Studios was the biggest studio in Asia at the time. And so they said, we're going to invest in this and we're going to do this in color. And the first color science fiction fantasy movie that Toho did was Rodan. But that was in the Academy aspect ratio. And so with the Mysterians was their next color widescreen, their first widescreen color science fiction fantasy film. And it was a huge hit. It was, people in Japan, were blown away by it. People over here, especially kids, were like really taken with it because it kind of delivered on all the promises and the ballyhoo and the posters. The thing with those low budget movies, it would promise see the most spectacular movie ever made, and you really didn't get that when you went and saw the movie. You didn't quite get what was promised, and the Mysterians kind of delivered. You had these aliens, they had this dome that they built on Earth, that they had all kinds of crazy stuff going on, and you had giant robots, and you had Earth
Mogura.
Yeah. Yeah, that's correct. And Earth made super weapons, like super science, and it was just this big all-out war picture. Earth versus the flying saucers, basically. And but it was a fully scaled military assault. So it was pretty spectacular at the time. So people were kind of blown away by it. It came to the States. People loved it in the States, of course, but you had critics. People lined up for these movies back in the 50s when they were the big deal movies. They got the big press and, but critics, still were, film critics liked real movies.
Wow, they didn't like the fantasy stuff?
Well, they didn't like genre films, Okay. So, the Western had to be like an all-star Western with top name actors. If it was just what they used to call, and the critics used to, have different terms for, it was just kind of like ground out Westerns, like what they used to call program pictures. The studios called them programmers because they followed a basic formula and they just made tons of them, and they would be called odors.
Odors?
Yeah, OATERS.
Okay.
Oats.
Okay.
Because horses eat oats.
Oh, okay.
So they were called odors. And science fiction pictures were just called science fiction pictures. But eventually, because of the low budget nature of a lot of them, they kind of looked down upon.
Was when Godzilla first came over, was that well received here in America?
That was really well received by the public. Some critics said, this was terrible, or, this is just another one of these god-awful monster pictures. And they didn't care. They weren't necessarily prejudiced against the film itself or the way it was executed. It was just the fact that it was a monster picture, that they were already wrote it off before they reviewed it. And then there were reviews that were really positive, like Variety magazine, the big showbiz paper. They gave it a very positive review when it opened.
And they were reviewing the American version, right?
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah. And they gave it a review that, said some of the special effects were startling. And they gave it a fairly positive review. So even a so-so or a positive review would be considered like a monumental triumph for one of these pictures at that time. Because, you really was hard to get positive reviews for sci-fi, horror, and fantasy films.
No kidding. How did so Mysterians did well with the public over here? How did like Rodan and Mothra? How those movies do well?
Yeah. So I'll preface that with Godzilla. When Godzilla opened,
sure,
it just blew away box office records on the East Coast. Again, that was one of those things where it opened on the East Coast first and spread across the country. It broke all kinds of records, and in fact, one of Godzilla's earliest fans who became a famous person was Martin Scorsese.
Okay, yeah.
And he used to deliver papers when he was a kid, and when Godzilla opened, he would go deliver his papers as fast as he could so he could get his money right away, and then he would get across town to go see it again.
Really? Damn.
Yeah, he's actually quoted as doing that. That he was just so obsessed with this movie, with the original Godzilla film, he just went and saw it multiple times when it played in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the reason that movie became such a hit, and then that created a market in the United States for the Japanese monster pictures, which were also popular in Japan. So Toho started making these movies as a response to their homegrown audience, but you had an American interest that they were also catering to.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes some of these pictures were pre-bought. So Toho, like one of the American studios would go to Toho and go, "What do you got?" And they go, "Well, our next picture is going to be this, and we're going to start shooting in 3 months." And then they go, "We'll buy that right now."
They would buy it without even seeing any film or anything. They just
right.
go and be like, "Okay, we're in on this."
Right. So Rodan was one of the first movies that, because Godzilla opened in 1956, stomped all over America that year.
Mm-hmm.
So other people immediately started scrambling for the next Godzilla, because if you bought a picture from Japan, you could buy them cheap.
Mm-hmm.
It would be a lot more cost effective to buy these movies than to produce one in the States. And so they had people just jumping at these films, and these guys these film entrepreneurs called the King brothers picked up Rodan. And the interesting thing about that is they got a work print from Toho. The film hadn't been finally cut for Japan yet, and they got a work print. And so there are some scenes and shots or takes in the American version that aren't in the Japanese, and vice versa.
Really? Okay.
So it's an interesting, a thing that they did. They trimmed the film down a little bit. They added a prologue that was needed in American films at the time, where the atomic bomb, it's like one of those things. You have to do the whole atomic thing at the front of the movie. But Rodan became, I think Rodan was the second Japanese monster movie released in the States. And that came out in 1957. And according to Box Office Magazine, again, the same exhibitors trade magazine, listed it as the highest grossing science fiction film of 1957 in the United States.
Really? Holy crap.
Yeah. It had the most rentals because, again, it was a color picture.
Right.
which, you know, when kids heard this movie's in color, you know, like black and white was already getting tired, you know, tiring with people. It was the common. It was the status quo. So if someone had a color picture, you wanted to go see that, you know, and then you determined whether it was awful or not after the fact that you were, it was like 3D now, you know, like, go see it 3D.
Although 3D now is almost getting played out.
Yeah, it's pretty passe now, but you know, it's the same, it was a gimmick. Color was a gimmick in a way. And so, you know, people ran to that movie. Mothra was a film that was pre-sold to Columbia Pictures. Columbia Pictures picked up, Columbia Pictures at the time would do 3-picture deals, and they also reached out to Hammer and said, you know, Hammer Studios in England, and they said, well, we've got these, you know, these next couple of pictures we're going to do are these, and then, you know, Columbia, we'll take that film, and, you know, we'll help you produce that one. And we'll just throw the money at you so we get the exclusive rights to it, and that'll help you produce the picture, level up the quality. And so they weren't technically co-productions because Columbia Pictures wasn't really sticking their fingers in it. Sometimes they'd get, you know, other studios did this as well with Hammer and Toho. It wasn't like they said, well, you know, give us the script and we're going to approve the script ourselves. They just said, make the movies and give them to us. You know, we'll worry about if there's anything objectionable in the film when we get it, we'll just cut it out, you know, or we'll change it.
Right.
So they bought the H-Man, which was a 1958 film, and invested in Battle in Outer Space, which was a 1959 film. And the third part of their 3-picture deal was Mothra. And so Toho had already made the H-Man. So that was a very Japanese homegrown film set in suburban Tokyo and with the underworld in it, a Japanese mob and drug trade and a radioactive sludge monster, or not really sludge, but a liquefied globby type monster. Humans was actually like a Japanese fishing trawler caught in an American atomic test area. Their reaction to the nuclear fallout is they dissolve, and they become this intelligence.
Really?
That starts. It has a homing instinct, and it comes back to Japan.
They dissolve into some like green goo or something, huh?
Right.
Yeah.
So, you know, Columbia had that. There was a couple little racy things in there because the standards at the time in America for films, and especially for, like, you know, they weren't marketing some of these films strictly to children, but they would get there were certain standards that, you know, you had some of the movies set in a cabaret, and the girls' outfits were sometimes a little too skimpy that were allowed in American films at the time.
So they just cut it?
So they cut some things out or worked around it. Or zoom boxed some of the stuff. But it pretty much got over here without too much alterations. And then, you know, Battle in Outer Space, Toho was kind of doing a follow-up to the Mysterians. And when Columbia said, we'll take it, Toho upped the ante because they had more money to work with, even though they were doing, you know, pretty much throwing money at these movies at the time. Toho was. So they took that extra money and they said, well, you know, let's go round up a international cast, you know. So they went around, they incorporated a lot of Caucasian faces, non-Asian faces into the movie as well, to kind of like, so it would be a better sell overseas.
Sure.
And with Mothra, you know, Columbia just said, what are you doing? We'll just take it. And, and here's money to do it. And the original ending was going to be sort of this, how familiar are you with Mothra?
Oh, very familiar.
Okay. So the original end of the picture was a lot smaller. And I don't mean that in a low budget way. It was just, they already had the spectacle of Mothra destroying Tokyo. So that was sort of that was the big spectacle, sequence of the movie, which takes up a lot of the running time. Towards the end in that third act. Well, Columbia Pictures said, we want to make this movie bigger, better. The original ending that didn't make it into the final print was that Nelson kidnaps the girls and he at the end of the American, the version that we all see now, Japanese and American version. Nelson, the bad guy, right?
Yep.
Okay, so Nelson's this bad guy. If you don't know what I'm talking about out there, I'm sure you could wiki it.
Yeah, just wiki it. He kidnaps these little girls.
Yeah. He's like an international jewel thief. He's kind of like a bad Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
He's kind of like the other guy, the Belloc. He's kind of like Belloc. He goes around and steals artifacts and treasures and stuff like that. So
and the treasure in this is these two little mini twins that sing.
Yeah, that are the guardian priests, or the priestesses of Mothra.
Right.
So he snatches them and puts them in a show like Carl Denham. It's kind of an inversion of. I call Mothra an inversion of King Kong.
It really is, actually, when you think about it.
And so he kidnaps the girls, puts them in a show. Then they find out that there's a connection. The authorities find out that there's a connection between the girls and Mothra, and the reason why Mothra is coming to Tokyo is because the girls are in Tokyo, blah, blah, blah. And the girls can't stop the telepathic connection between the two. So Nelson decides to bail. And in the final film you see, he goes back to his country, which is a hybrid of Russia and the United States, because they didn't want to blame one country in this film. The Japanese were like, well, we don't want to say it's America. We don't want to say it's Russia conducting these tests, these nuclear tests.
So would they call it Rolisica?
Yeah, Rolisica.
Rolisica, yeah.
Which is a portmanteau of the Japanese pronunciations of America, which is America, and Russia, which is Russia. So Rolisica.
Rolisica, okay.
So they came up with Rolisica. And so Nelson takes off to there, and then Mothra follows him. And the big city, the big New York, San Francisco is a New York San Francisco hybrid called Newkirk City.
Yep.
And so Mothra comes in and wrecks more stuff. So it's got even more spectacle on top of spectacle with this big finale with the winged Mothra destroying everything now that it's hatched out of its cocoon. Well, this is a long story. But anyway, the long and short of it is that the original ending was Nelson takes off in a Cessna instead of escaping on, he gets on a, American Airlines or a Pan Am jet or whatever. Mm-hmm. And has to smuggle through the airport with a fake passport. In the original ending, which they shot, Nelson was the first thing they shot. Honda went on location to go shoot the ending first. Because it was a volcano, near a volcano range. I think it was on Mount Mihara, where Godzilla falls into the crater at the end of Godzilla 1985.
Yeah.
Trivia. It's considered part of the Tokyo, not metropolitan area, the Tokyo prefecture. And so it's an island off the shore of Tokyo. So they go to shoot location there. And Nelson is supposed to take off in this little Cessna with the girls and his one henchman. And the plane isn't fueled or something, and it crashes. They're actually supposed to be in a northern region. They get as far up as Hokkaido, which is far up north in Japan. And I guess with the thing that Nelson would run away to try to get out of Japan and hop over to Russia with the girls or whatever. And so he ditches the plane. They get out. Mothra's following. Mothra lands and flaps her wings, and Nelson flies off a cliff and dies. And pretty much right behind, Nelson are the main characters. So they witness this whole thing when Mothra lands and causes indirectly the death of Nelson. And the girls are retrieved and happy ending. Well, they filmed this first.
Yep.
And then they come back from location, Honda and company, and the front office goes, oh, well, we're going to scrap that ending. And they're like, what? It's like, well, we got an order from Columbia Pictures to do a different ending. And so they want this big spectacle ending with a whole other city getting wrecked, but they want like a Western city to get destroyed.
Oh, geez.
Right. So, there was part of the original short story that was made. It was they took it originally out of the script, not out of the script necessarily, but I mean out of the all the preliminary stuff they wrote, there was going to be an attack on New Wagon City.
Oh, wow. What a great name there.
Yeah, they're going like, America, cowboys, Indians, and wagons, wagon trains. And, of course, that was in I think, in the treatments, and which were probably sent to Columbia. And Columbia goes, you're doing a smaller ending. Why? We want this ending. Here's the money. I think it was one of the Columbia producers named William Schwartz. And he went and just said, here, take this money, and we want a big finish.
So then they had to reshoot it, huh? Or redo
so,
it.
yeah, they just basically had to reshoot an ending. And then Tsuburaya, who had already wrapped, I think, did he already wrap? No, he didn't wrap the special effects work, but he was given like I'm going off the top of my head here. So when he heard that they had to construct more sets and keep working on this movie because they had other movies lined up, Eiji Tsuburaya, the special effects director, like flipped his lid. In a rare flipping his lid, he's like, what do you mean we have to build a whole city set? And they begrudgingly had to do it at the bequest of Columbia Pictures. And I think it actually makes the film a lot better.
I like the film. I mean, I thought the film was actually pretty good. I enjoyed it.
It's one of my. I think it's one of my top favorites from that period.
Now, did they know that they were creating this eventual shared universe when they were making Godzilla and then Rodan and Mothra?
No,
they were making one-offs at the time.
Yeah, they were just going like, we're going to make these pictures, and then it became this natural thing of like, let's team things up.
Right.
Let's have this guy punch this guy. What if Superman fought Spider-Man?
Right.
And then
except they were doing all this in the same studio, so they could easily answer that question.
Yeah, they could just do whatever they pretty much wanted. And I think a part of that actually did not. They weren't just sitting around going, well, let's have Mothra and Godzilla fight. Mm-hmm. It was pretty much out of necessity. As they were getting more orders for these pictures, there was like, I think, the next, they did, a follow-up to the first Godzilla film with Godzilla Raids Again in 1955, right. Which, it's an okay. It's a little shaky. They were just trying something different at that point. They go, let's just try something different with each picture.
I like the fight scenes, but the overall story is kind of a little.
Well, they were experimenting with formula and seeing what they could do and mixing and matching directors. Like, so instead of naturally putting Honda in charge of the sequel, they said, let's see how another director will do. Mm. And then, of course, they went, well, Honda keeps hitting pay dirt, so we're just going to he's going to get all of them, pretty much all of them. At one point, they were producing so many fantasy pictures, that they couldn't have Honda direct every one. They brought in other people to take over sort of like, the lesser films. Like, they would go like, okay, we're going to do a movie about a man who teleports electronically and then goes around the country and killing people. Going through the phone lines, that was the secret of the Telegean. And they went, well, we're also making another picture that same year. We're in this, in this production year, we're going to make this movie about a man who's transformed into a vaporous substance, and he can reconfigure himself and
which movie is that?
Himself. The Human Vapor from 1960.
Oh God!
And the secret of the Telegean was 1960. And they said, well, this is going to be the stronger picture. We're going to put the bigger stars in this. We're going to put the more money in this. So we'll have Honda pick up this one, and we'll give this one has a little more of a lurid action thing to it. So we'll give it to our action crime guy Jun Fukuda, and we'll let him direct that one. So. They did that a lot. So you had, after they did the Godzilla Raids Again in 55, which did good but didn't do great, and then Rodan came out and was a huge hit the next year. They had another film come out towards the end of 55 called The Half Human. It was an Abominable Snowman movie. And they went, well, okay. And Honda directed the Abominable Snowman movie.
Is that a kaiju film, or is it?
Well, he's an Abominable Snowman. He's not like a giant city crushing guy. Okay. He's just a big, he's like the traditional Abominable Snowman kind of picture. And and Honda and Tsuburaya worked on that one. So they kind of gave Godzilla a rest because they did, they did Rodan, which is a big hit. They moved on with Mysterians, and then it was a couple more years later. They said, maybe we should, Godzilla kind of capture the imagination of the general public and the media because he keeps being brought up, like they go like a tough guy. Who do you think you are, Godzilla?
Right.
Like even movies like in 1960, there was a movie I believe it's 1960. I'm sure someone will correct me. Made by one of the other Japanese studios, Nikatsu, which is called Danger Pays.
Did you put this in your book, right? About
this is what I'm telling you right now?
Yeah.
No.
This wasn't in the book? Okay.
No.
You had talked about Godzilla Knock-Offs in the book.
Right. Well, yeah, there was, not really, the knockoffs, but that, people kept bringing up his name in the media. Like people kept referencing Godzilla. Like your mother looks like Godzilla,
Right.
People were capping on each other. Comedians would use Godzilla as a punchline joke. And then there's this movie from, I think 1960. Now, this is between Godzilla raids again in 1955, and the next Godzilla picture didn't open in Japan until 1962, which is King Kong versus Godzilla. So this is 1960. And there's a movie by another studio, not Toho Studios, Nikatsu Studios, which was known for a lot of action movies. And they did this crime movie it's a crime comedy. It's great. It's fantastic. It's hilarious. And it's very, very violent and bloody at the same time, which is a really strange juxtaposition, but it's just awesome. And you could watch that on Amazon Prime Video. Danger Pays, 1960. There's a scene in the movie where there's three main characters, all three of them are criminals. They're arguing about this counterfeit money. And one of them says, you're mean like Godzilla. And so that's another studio referencing a different studio's character while there was no current movies being made at all.
What the hell?
Yeah, so Godzilla really captured the Japanese imagination, the public's imagination, and the pop culture imagination. So Toho said, we should just bring him back. Let's do another picture. And they were looking for a vehicle, and that's a whole nother story with this guy, John Beck, in Hollywood, who was a former Universal producer, who fell into talking to Willis O'Brien, who was the effects guy for King Kong, and Son of Kong, and Mighty Joe Young, and so on. And he was trying to develop another Kong picture called King Kong versus Frankenstein.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading
right.
About that.
And the long and short of that, somebody could go, if you're listening and going, Frankenstein, how could Kong fight Frankenstein? And it was going to be a monster stitched together from the parts of big African big game animals.
That would have been
so that's the Frankenstein part of that. Anyway, they were going to, and Carl Denham's involved again. Carl Denham's trying to have a comeback, and he promotes a boxing match between the two. What? Of course, now people are going,
really going crazy.
Yeah, Kong died in 1933. What happened? And then Willis O'Brien worked out a thing where it's like, he didn't really die. He was just really messed up. Sort of like King Kong Lives,
Right. Oh, yeah.
Same thing. It's like, he's not dead.
We just put an artificial heart in him.
He's messed up. We're gonna stick this thing in his chest and resuscitate him.
Right.
So he had this idea, and Willis O'Brien couldn't sell it to anyone. And John Beck, who was this scheming little guy out of Universal, former Universal guy trying to hit it up on his own, said, "Hey, let me run with this idea and talk to people." Well, eventually he basically stole the idea and took it to Toho. And Toho had offices in Los Angeles. And they said, "Wow, that would be great. You can get the rights to King Kong. Then we could have King Kong versus Godzilla." And Eiji Tsuburaya, that was his favorite movie. That's King Kong. And that's what launched him into wanting to do special effects after being a cinematographer for, 2 decades. And so...
why didn't they nail the suit, though, in King? Why is the suit not great in that movie?
That's part of the John Beck problem. And John Beck comes in and says, he's negotiating everything. And he goes, well, I'll have Universal release it. He still had his peeps at Universal. And he said, I can get Toho to produce this picture, and I'm going to be the producer, distributor, and I'll just sub-license it to you, Universal. You don't have to put up any production money. I'll get Toho to put up all the money, and I'll sell it to you. So Universal got international rights into perpetuity, which means Toho has no claim to this day, unless Universal says, we'll give it back to you.
Which isn't going to happen anytime soon.
Which isn't going to happen.
Right.
Because, you have to hire lawyers to work all that out, and Universal doesn't want to spend that money. Nobody wants to spend that money in Hollywood. For an unnecessary film that's 50 years old, they don't care. They really don't care. It's just something they pull out of the vault every once in a while and put it out on the latest home media, and that's all they really care about. And so Beck engineers this whole thing, then tells Toho they have to go to RKO, the remnants of RKO, through, I think Universal was managing that at the time. I may be wrong. Somebody will probably correct me. That's fine. But I'm just going off the top of my head.
We're just talking out. We're just talking casually.
Talking out loud. Yeah. So you had this whole thing set up, and Toho's planning. Meanwhile, Toho's planning on dumping all this money into it, and they're going to film on location all the island scenes in Sri Lanka.
Oh yeah,
they're trying to rearrange all this stuff. They're going to go film on location. There's not going to be any indoor sets unless it's supposed to be an indoor shot, like a building or a house or an apartment or whatever. And they're just going to lay out all this money to make this movie. So they're already, working on sets, and they're already building stuff, and they're making the new Godzilla suit, and they're building the miniature sets and working on all that. And John Beck comes to Toho and goes, okay, well, now you guys got to pay the rights for King Kong. And they went, what?
Oh, no.
It said, well, if you want to make this picture, you got to pay for Kong. We're not paying for it. I'm not paying for it. And so it was the equivalent at that time of $1 million to hire Kong.
Yikes.
For the film. So there went a large part of the budget. So Sri Lanka was out.
Gone.
And that's why the Kong suit looks ratty. They just didn't have the money to do an elaborate Kong suit.
Wow.
And some people could say, well, they could have just made anything in the shop. Well, then you don't know how movies are made. I'm sorry. You don't know how movies are produced and how things are allotted and how budgets have to be adhered to. And when the producers go, I don't want you spending another dime. We're not going to buy more latex and yak hair.
You're kind of stuck.
Just make a gorilla suit and we're going to go. We got to make this picture.
I mean, it's still an all-time picture. It's just there's the Kong suit's a lot to left to be desired.
Right, but at the same time, you had then movies come out, around that same time period. You got, the more the sort of stereotypical gorilla suits and the gorilla guys at that time. You had movies like Gorilla at Large coming out in the late 50s, early mid 50s, and early 60s. You had Konga. Which is just basically a guy in that same suit from Gorilla at Large, and you sometimes see him in in the Three Stooges shorts. It's the same gorilla guy, in the same gorilla suit, and it looks like a gorilla, but Kong's not really a gorilla to begin with. He's a bit different. But anyway, so yeah, Toho just had to kind of suck it up and go, we got deadlines and we got to make this picture. We're already committed. The Americans are already setting release dates. We got to get this stuff. We got to make it, do or die. We just can't back. There's no way to back out.
Right.
What was that? What was that Kevin Costner picture from the 80s or early 90s? Well, I think it's like 80s. No Way Out.
Yeah, right.
No way out. There was no way out for Toho. They just had to suck it up and do it. The same kind of thing happened on another picture they did like several years later, which is called Latitude Zero, which has Joseph Cotton in it, and Richard Jekyll, and Cesar Romero, and Patricia Medina, who was Joseph Cotton's wife. And it's a sci-fi pot boiler kind of fantasy underwater picture that probably would have been amazing if it was made in the 50s. Mm-hmm. It's kind of anachronistic being made in the late 60s, even though there were several underwater pictures of the same ilk being made around the same time. Like MGM produced this thing called Captain Nemo and the Underwater City, like the same year, and released it the same year. But it was one of those things where they had an American producer. It was based on an American story, a series of radio plays. And they set this whole thing up, and then the American producer lost all his funding before Toho made the monsters for the movie. So the monster suits in that are ratty, but the miniature stuff that they built humongous. They built a 15-meter research vessel that's only in maybe 2 minutes of the movie.
Which movie is this again?
Latitude Zero.
Latitude Zero.
But anyway, it's like Toho faced that a couple of times, and then you also have a lot of people don't really realize that, you don't have the time that they do now where, they make something like Infinity War or Endgame and they go, okay, well, we're going to take, where they spend like a year to do just the visual effects,
Right.
Because
they have a lot more time now.
Right. And they've got a year or 2 years to make these pictures.
They plan it out better.
Yeah. Well, it's not necessarily planned out better. It's like they allow for these films to be fully realized now.
Right.
When they're the big tentpole pictures. Whereas when you were still at the studio system, the old studio system is like Toho at their height were putting out 2 new movies every 2 weeks.
Jesus Christ. I can't imagine that kind of shooting schedule nowadays.
And those were double features. Back when they still did double features. So you had the A picture and then you had the B picture. And B doesn't mean bad. B grade doesn't mean poor. B grade is a support picture because you want 2 movies and they might be totally 2 different genres. Like I think the co-feature with the original Mothra when it opened in Japan was a comedy. So you had the monster film and then you had a comedy. So it was just a matter of putting together a package of entertainment, an evening's entertainment for, general audiences. Mm-hmm. And the same thing that was being done in America. We'd have the A picture and the B picture. And, that B thing kind of stuck when people started referencing those movies in the 60s and 70s in books. And that kind of like, it still sticks today. Yeah, it's sort of like B means poor.
I was going to say, is that the origin of like a B list actor or B list movie or B movie? Okay.
Exactly. That's exactly where that comes from. So the American studio system called it an A picture and a B picture.
No kidding. Okay. I had no idea.
And so, B doesn't necessarily mean bad, even though, like, again, you get to something like a company like Universal where their A picture would be like Monolith Monsters and then the B picture would be like a really bad movie, because it's just like, well, kids are going to just come here on a Saturday matinee, doesn't matter. Right. So it'll be like a monster picture and a Western or an odor, real cheap, low budget Western, because you don't have to build a lot. They had standing Western sets, So then you got like the lesser known cowboy actors, these guys that just did nothing but cowboy pictures, So, and then the connotations when you get to like the smaller studios and film companies like PRC, Republic Pictures, their budgets were lower than the bigger studios, obviously. So then their B pictures were even worse, So the real true meaning of a B picture, like people think Plan 9 from Outer Space is a B movie, and Plan 9 from Outer Space is an independently produced terrible movie. It was independently produced, and then he just sold it to somebody that said, "We'll put it out somehow."
Jeez.
So there's, this general lumping in of everything that people kind of misconstrue. Was, when Mothra was released in the United States in July 1962, the co-feature was The Three Stooges in Orbit.
Really?
Yeah.
What the hell?
Now, when Columbia Pictures or Universal or whoever released these pictures, and they would have a B picture, sometimes that was a program you could buy into if you were a theater owner. You go, oh, I'll take that whole package, because then I don't have to think about booking a second feature. Mm-hmm. But sometimes they were given the option, and there would be that in the press kit where you would have the ad that you would clip, the theater would clip and send to the newspaper that had like Mothra now playing at the such and such theater, co-feature, and sometimes that would be blank. Mm-hmm. So you could build your own co-feature, build your own double feature. So they could pick another film if they wanted to. But the main one that Columbia was pushing would be Three Stooges in Orbit, but you could just pick your own one if you wanted to.
The audience member could pick their own one? Or the
theater owners.
Yeah, okay,
whoever was booking the theater or theaters in that town.
Got it.
You know, because sometimes there would be one theater company and they would own 2 or 3 theaters in the same town. And then, of course, back in those days, something that people can't imagine now is there were triple features sometimes.
Holy
there would
crap.
be
How long are these movies?
Well, back in those days, the longest movie you would get would be like 90 minutes.
Okay.
You know, I mean, if it was a big spectacle, like, you know, 10 Commandments, yeah, okay, well, that's like 2.5 hours or 2 hours or whatever, 2.5 hours. And they would have an intermission. Okay. The big spectacles like that. But I mean, your average movie would be anywhere between, you know, like 80 and 100 minutes long. And the B features would be shorter. Sometimes the B package film would be anywhere from 60 to 80 minutes, sometimes as short as, I mean, did I say 60? Mm-hmm. They would be sometimes generally average like 70 to 80 minutes long, sometimes 60. They could be as short as 60 minutes, especially in the 1940s when there was a lot of film noir being produced. So a lot of those pictures are fairly short, the B pictures, which are totally crackerjack if you see any of them, actually. They're very crackerjack movie.
August, I got to ask, man.
Yeah.
How the hell did you acquire all this knowledge? This isn't all from doing the book.
Oh, no, this is life experience, you know, compiled sad life experience, you know.
I mean, you're a walking encyclopedia.
Well, there's other kooks like me from the same generation where here's the deal. And again, like, you don't have to let me just interrupt whenever with a question or whatever, because otherwise I'll go like, Oh,
I've been letting you go for at least 45 minutes. It's been great.
Just shut me the hell up. You know,
no, it's
interrupt
good.
with a question because that's stimulating too. But I might actually be a lot more productive and shorter in my explanations of things. But back when I grew up, which was pretty much growing up in the 70s, where you really know what you're looking at, and you're starting to tie names together to things at an age where you're not just a little kid just going, I like this movie.
Right, just sitting there absorbing things without thinking about it.
Right, where you start really kind of like connecting the dots and recognizing the actors between pictures. And at the time I grew up, you still had cartoons on TV that were old cartoons for us at that time. You had like Bugs Bunny, the Merry Melodies, Looney Tunes. The Merry Melodies are the older Looney Tunes, right? Mm-hmm. From the 30s. And, those were in color and those were still on TV. And you would see these things like it was like Hollywood Parade of 1938. This is like 1972, 1973. And you're seeing, the Hollywood Parade of 1938. And they're making fun of like, they're doing parodies of like Clark Gable and other big Hollywood actors, Eddie Cantor, comedians. And I know their names from watching these cartoons. Mm-hmm. And I knew who they were from the movies that were playing on local television at the time, because we didn't have 180 channels to choose from, and you couldn't build your own programming like you can now.
Right.
So cable was the first thing that kind of took away being force-fed in the best way possible of cinematic education. When I was growing up, you had locally we had 6 channels. You had like 4, if you remember, anybody remembers this, you had 4 VHF channels and maybe 2 or 3 UHF channels, which was a different frequency, right?
Okay.
And so, 3 of the channels would be network affiliates, NBC, CBS, ABC. And then you had local channels. And all of them had local channels, but they didn't carry that affiliate program, so that the stuff that people watched all across the country, like, Charlie's Angels or $6 Million Man or whatever, we saw that all across the country, but none of us were watching the same channel. We were watching the local affiliates broadcast in wherever you lived in the United States. It wasn't one big nationwide broadcast. And so, like with cable, it's just one signal going out to everybody through a satellite, right? Mm-hmm. And so you had those choices of those channels, and if you didn't like what NBC, ABC, and CBS had, like our local NBC was KRON Channel 4, you had CBS was KPIX5, and ABC was KGO7. So, if you didn't like any of that stuff, you could watch KTVU Channel 2, which was our big local independent, which had a huge film library. These other channels who were the affiliates, they just didn't sit around all day waiting for the networks to kick on in the evening, starting with the national news at 6 or whatever it was. They would have programming all day, and they would have their own film libraries. They would have old TV shows that they bought, and they would have their own locally produced television shows. So every station around the country would have locally produced television shows that I could say when I grew up, I saw Captain Satellite. He hosted kids' cartoons. And a person in Sacramento, about 80 miles away, we had Captain Sacto. And someone in Los Angeles had someone else, and someone in Philly had Wee Willie Weaver.
Sure.
And somebody in New York had a different cartoon host. And then they had the rise of the horror hosts that came out of that, too. And you had the kid shows, you had Bozo. Bozo show all across the country was the local Bozo.
Really?
If you could believe it. Oh, yeah. There'd be local personalities. Okay. So the company that owned Bozo, would say, you can have the Bozo show. You just pay the franchise and you do your own franchise in your own city.
Oh, see, I always thought it was just one Bozo across the nation.
Yeah, there was the one main guy, Gary Harmon, I think his name was. God, how do I remember this crap?
I've been wondering this the entire show already. How do you remember all this?
See, it's all useless junk. It's totally useless.
It's interesting though.
It doesn't give me a better job. It doesn't.
It provides interesting content though for an audio podcast. Let me tell you.
Yes, it does. But anyway, so you had all this local programming, and these stations had their own movies, and Channel 2 also had a show that was probably done all over the country. I'm sure it was done all over the country. Dialing for Dollars. Everybody had a Dialing for Dollars show. It was lampooned by SCTV, where you have the guy giving away money while you're watching the movie. You just have to answer the question that was like, today's secret number is, and then later we're going to call somebody, and they pulled a number out of the phone book, or people sent letters or postcards into the show, and they would write their phone number down. We're calling Miss J. Johnson of Sebastopol. What's today's count in the amount? And what's the name of today's movie or whatever? And then you'd win a pot of money, right? And so on those shows, they would show the movies from their library, so you'd get to see film noir, you got to see these movies from the 40s and 50s. And then of course, with monster stuff, there was a time when I was growing up where there were at least, on local television, there were at least over various channels, not just one channel, you could see up to 6 or 8 horror, sci-fi, and fantasy films per week on television at different times of the day, on different days of the week.
And this is which years again?
Oh, this started before I was born. But,
okay.
You had it all started in 1958 with Universal Pictures. At the very early days of television, the big studios were like, television's the enemy, it's lowbrow, it's garbage. And we don't want, and stations, the companies, the TV companies were going to the studios and going, we want to buy your movies and we can show them on TV. Wouldn't that be great? Buy your old catalog. You're not showing them anymore. We can show them on TV. Sell them to us, license them to us, lease them to us.
Right.
And the Hollywood studios were like, F you. Motion pictures can't be compromised by television. You're just going to put dog food commercials in them. And there was a lot of resistance. Of course, then they saw how much money that could be made from TV, and they relented, and eventually Universal Pictures had a cooperation with the television division of Columbia Pictures, which was called Screen Gems. And they put together this package of, I think it was something like 30 Universal horror films and some Columbia horror films called Shock. And they did this big whole promotion. They did this big press kit, and they sent it to stations all over the country. Be the first station in your area. Don't get left out. Don't let some of your rival station, get these films. They're going to be surefire Boffo ratings. Kids are going to want to watch these crazy movies. And so they sold these things to stations. That caused a whole new generation of kids to see Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy, the Wolfman, and created the monster boom of the 60s. Mm-hmm. That's what sold. The reason why we have Addams Family, the Munsters, and a revival of the horror picture in the 60s is because of this Shock package. And so the Shock package went out to TV and the stations, or how can we promote this locally? And had been somebody recalled that there was a person who hosted late night horror films in Los Angeles in the early 50s that came and went, but she made a big sensation, and she was like in Time not Time, but she was like in, I think, Life magazine, got a lot of national coverage, even though she was only on a local station, the ABC affiliate in New York, and it was a live show. It wasn't recorded. And her name was Vampira. And she was the archetype horror host. She would tell wry, bad jokes when they came back from commercial and then we're going back to the movie. She'd do little skits or whatever. And so this was the formation of what we call the horror host. And so with the Shock movie package, there were places like, again, the different bozos, the different cartoon hosts all over the country. There became horror hosts everywhere, all across the country, that people in there, some of them started in the 50s. This whole phenomenon of horror hosts lasted well into the 80s, even though cable was starting to kill local stations being able to have big film libraries, because guys like Ted Turner were buying up all these packages from the studios and throwing money at them for exclusivity. So all of a sudden, all this disappeared from local television.
Just getting onto cable.
Yeah, all across the country. You can watch the there was Ted Turner to watch the MGM channel. There's nothing but MGM movies. Mm-hmm. That's it, right. But so then a local station couldn't show them, Right. So anyway, so this horror host thing happened. So when I'm a kid, we had a local horror host. We had several, one of them way before I was born. And then we had another one that I just caught a little bit of, a guy called Asmodeus, who hosted his show out of Castle Noir. Or was it Chateau? I think it was Chateau Noir. But then we got this guy named Bob Wilkins, who didn't have a gimmick. A lot of these guys wore capes and dressed like monsters or mad scientists and had, I'm Morgus the Magnificent or whatever. That's a real guy, too. And then we had Bob Wilkins, who came on in a suit. He had a pair of glasses, and he smoked a cigar. And he was a youngish guy, and he would go, "Tonight's movie is so terrible." It was delivered to Channel 2 in a brown paper envelope. No return address. He would do these, he was deadpan. He was an ad guy that fell into hosting television. And he was our horror host. And his show was sometimes locally. Now, San Francisco is one of the bigger television markets. And it used to, at the time, the big three television markets, that's where they would test shows. Mm-hmm. If they were worthy of being national network shows, were San Francisco, Chicago, and New York.
Okay.
And San Francisco was a big market. And Bob's show started before Saturday Night Live came on the air, before it was, launched. Mm-hmm. And he became this big phenomenon. And then when Saturday Night launched and became a huge hit, It's obviously Saturday Night Live is still on. So the original one must have been a hit, right? Pop culture changing show. Our show, the Bob Wilkins show, which was called Creature Features, would routinely beat Saturday Night Live in the San Francisco ratings.
Really?
Yeah.
What the hell?
Yeah. Locally produced show. He would have a market of 1 million viewers every Saturday night. So his show, when he first debuted in 1971, he started out with one movie at 9 o'clock, and within 6 months, they went to a double feature. And then his show was on, in 1979, he decided to bail. He had been hosting horror films since 1966. And so he decided to quit in 1979. But if he hadn't decided to quit at that point, he would have kept going, because he was actually, at the same time while he was hosting a show in San Francisco, he was hosting a show in Sacramento, 80 miles north. Mm-hmm. And he would drive up to Sacramento once a week to film that show and then back down to the Bay Area. So, and he continued with the Sacramento show because of his contract with that station until about, I think it was 1984. So he was this huge phenomenon. I mean, he did a public appearance for the opening of an animated feature called Jack and the Beanstalk that Columbia Pictures or whoever had him promoting on Creature Features, and it happened to have been a Japanese animated film. But anyway, so like there must have been 400 kids that showed up to meet him, and then the crowd got bigger that all wanted his autograph.
Jeez.
And it was really crazy. So you had horror hosts all over the country that were all as popular as Bob Wilkins.
Just in their local market.
And people love them and remember them to this day. Mm-hmm. And there are websites devoted. There's a documentary I recommend you checking out if you're even remotely interested in the phenomena of the American horror host. A friend of mine worked on this documentary. This friend of mine, Mike Monahan, who also wrote a book about the history of Bay Area horror hosts, which is indispensable, called Shock It to Me, The Golden Ghouls of the Golden Gate. He also worked on a film called American Scary. He conducted all the interviews with all the horror hosts for that film. And I believe... I'm sorry?
I was going to say, so I live in Chicago. Was our horror host Svengoolie?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is he the same? So is he the same kind of guy you're talking about, a horror host?
Right. Exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
They all do different shtick.
Right.
But your Svengoolie used to be the son of Svengoolie because there was another Svengoolie before him.
Got it. Okay.
In the 70s, and that was a guy who was amazing. I mean, there's still videos of his shows that are on YouTube of just his host segments, and they're crazy. They're really crazy. And he was only on a couple of years, but he left an indelible impact in Chicago television history.
He was only around, this says 3 years, Jerry G. Bishop.
Yeah. Mr. Bishop. Hilarious.
Yeah.
I mean, and Svengoolie, the current Svengoolie, was a fan of Jerry G. Bishop. He was a devoted fan and said, can I do it? You're gone. Can I take over the mantle? Will you give me permission to become the next Svengoolie?
No kidding.
And that's the second instance of one fan becoming following in the footsteps of his favorite horror host. There was a guy in Cleveland called Ghoulardi in the 60s, early 60s. And he created this guy would blow up stuff on TV. Mm-hmm. He would blow up model kits. People would send him model kits just for him to put a firecracker in it and blow it up on the air, which you can't do now.
No, you can't do that.
We're going to blow something up in the studio. And he had this whole beatnik rift, and his name was Ernie Anderson. And eventually he was comedic partners in Cleveland with a guy named Tim Conway, who became very famous a few years later. Like McHale's Navy and the Carol Burnett Show. And they decided they got an offer to move to Los Angeles to do a Western, a comic Western for network television. Tim Conway being sort of like a goofy, like deputy, right? and Ernie Anderson mostly is kind of a straight man. Well, they made the pilot, and they were waiting to get an approval for a series, and they had moved from Cleveland. Said, we're done with Cleveland TV. Goulardi is going away, and then the network came in and said, we like the Conway kid, but we got to get rid of you, Anderson. We don't know what to do with you. So they kept Conway, like they broke up the band, basically,
Mm-hmm.
And Ernie Anderson went, well, what the hell? I'm not going to go back to crawl back to Cleveland and do the same stuff. So he eventually became the voice of ABC, The Love Boat. So he was the announcer at ABC that day, tonight on The Love Boat. And he is the father of Paul Anderson, the director, the famous movie director.
Oh, what the fuck?
Yep.
All comes full circle.
Yeah. So I recommend you checking out this documentary, American Scary. It's got Jerry G. Bishop, Chicago's original Svengoolie, passed away, unfortunately, but he's interviewed in this documentary. And Bob Wilkins is in this documentary, my horror host. And they got as many guys that were still breathing to do it, including the original horror host who has since also, she has passed, Mila Nurmi, who once dated James Dean, who was Vampira.
Jesus Christ, you know a lot of shit, man.
It's just, I wish I could remember things that would actually be useful as a skill.
Yeah, well, let's get to the present day. So, what do you think about the upcoming Godzilla film? Or do you know anything? What are your thoughts? Let me just leave it there, because I know you can go.
Yeah, I have. I'm not going to say I have controversial thoughts. I think kids. What I consider what are kids today.
Yeah, what are kids do? Under 13?
If you're 30, if you're 30 or younger, you're a kid.
So I'm actually 31, so I'm an adult.
Okay, so you're not a kid anymore.
Good.
You're an adult. But no, I can understand the cultural perspective of people just being excited to see this character transition into a tentpole Hollywood picture with all the lavish stuff that comes with it. Whereas I grew up seeing promises of these things that were going to be lavishly done with big modern budgets that left a lot to be desired, at first. So like the 76 Kong, which was extremely disappointing.
Yeah.
It was disappointing to people at the time. But, we were told it was going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread. You had Dino De Laurentiis saying, when the Maya Kong die, everybody cry.
They also built a 30-foot Kong that they used in one or two scenes.
Yeah, it was like Carlo Rambaldi, the guy who built E.T., and he did the alien, the one animatronic alien at the end of Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Mm-hmm.
Did a bunch of stuff in Italy. Anyway, so did monsters for like Hercules pictures too in the 60s, the peplums, the sword and sandal pictures. But the 2014 movie came out, the Gareth Edwards thing, and, I kind of went in just sort of, ambivalent.
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoyed it. A lot of people didn't like it. They thought it was boring. It didn't have enough action in it.
I liked it.
Focused too much on the one character. But I thought that the way that it was plotted and the way that it was paced was closer to an actual Japanese monster picture than most people would have done.
Mm-hmm.
It just sort of had that pacing and the reveals were kind of. It made me feel that it was a natural inheritor, and they were paying attention to the source material.
Mm-hmm.
With this picture, the director is saying, "No, we're talking about King of the Monsters." The director is I'm a fan and I love these movies and I love these monsters and all that. But a lot of times that's what they're supposed to say.
Right.
They may actually like them. They may have seen them when they were a kid, but it's just kind of a fan service to get the fans to rally around them. They go, "He's one of us."
Michael Dougherty is the director,
right? And he may very well be. I mean, I don't know the guy. I don't know much about him. I try to stay away from as much spoilery material as possible, not because I'm banking on, like, when I go in, I just want to experience this thing for myself. It's like I kind of don't care.
Mm-hmm.
it's just the lip service. And okay, so here's an example. I avoided most of the trailers. You know, I think I watched the first couple of trailers.
The trailers look good, but they've revealed a lot. So
well, yeah,
good.
You know, and I was just like, you know, do I really, you know, and it's like sometimes, you know, they put so much stuff in the trailer that's pretty much all that's all the bullet points that you'll see in the movie.
Right.
You know, and it's like, oh, well, I guess we saw that's a highlight reel of all the stuff that was in the movie. So it's interspersed over 2 hours, 3 minutes of action interspersed over 2 hours of a movie, which isn't the first time. It isn't a bad thing. Monster Zero. The climactic battle is less than 4 minutes long. Mm-hmm. You know, it's something like 3 minutes long. And it's like, but the whole movie is so good and the narrative moves in such a great way. And, you know, they have a battle in the middle. There's like a destruction scene where Rodan and Godzilla, Rodan, and Ghidorah go around smashing crap. And that's kind of cool. But when it comes to the Punch-Out, the final Punch-Out, I mean, it's matched to the music cue. You know, it's about like 3 minutes, you know, it's like, but and the combined monster scenes are something like 11 minutes out of a 90-minute picture, you know? That sounds like, oh my God, that's horrible. But the movie is so good. That's why it remains a lot of fans' favorite in Japan and the United States. People who grew up with that movie, especially, you know? It's just because it's well made and it's well crafted for what it is. And I don't know what to expect from this thing. And you know, you have a lot of King of the Monsters, that is, and a lot of people are, you know, just putting their eggs in such a big basket that, you know, it's bound to be disappointing for some people because they're putting all their hopes, you know, into this movie, that it's going to be the most amazing Godzilla thing they've ever seen in their lives. Well,
I think this is, correct me if I'm wrong, after Godzilla versus King Kong, I heard that Toho gets all the rights back. So these are the last Godzilla movies, right?
Well, what happens actually is that Toho has not given up rights.
Not the rights, but they're going to.
Yeah, well, it's basically, it's Legendary's contract runs out.
Right, there you go.
Yeah, so just to be specific, because there have been fans who are kind of confused on the internet that they really don't, you know, it's like, it's not necessary to know how studios deal in IPs, you know, intellectual properties. Mm-hmm. It's not necessary for you to enjoy movies or discuss movies because you don't know the legalese of everything, you know. But it's important to clear that when people become confused, you know, and a lot of fans, you know, are going like, Toho gave their rights away, you know.
No, they licensed it.
you know, it's like you have to kind of explain that to people and without being condescending and you know, hopefully they'll learn something, or they'll just, you know, be like, oh, okay, I feel better. Toho still has the rights, but they have to wait for the contract to expire. Okay, great, I got it.
Yeah.
You know, and that's like, you know, that's because some people think Toho just gave it away, you know.
They would never do that.
Yeah. So, you know, the Legendary's contract was for 3 movies.
Got it.
And that's basically, you know, the Hollywood standard 3-picture deal. Except Marvel, you know, the MCU broke all that. Right. Marvel Studios just totally destroyed that model, you know, once they got rolling. Once they knew they had something happening, you know, they went, oh, screw 3 pictures. We're just going to keep going. Although, you know, it's like you got Iron Man 1, 2, and 3, and you got Captain America 1, 2, and 3, and we've had 4 Avengers films, you know, so, and there's going to be 3 Guardians pictures and so on, 3 Thor movies.
3 usually works.
Yeah, 3 is usually, you know, it's the George Lucas model.
Right.
You know, and that's where that kind of came from, was the George Lucas model. Because, you know, if you had the 3-picture plan earlier than Star Wars, you know, you had, you know, we'd only have like 3 Sean Connery Bonds.
Right.
You know, and that's a sad thing about Star Wars. That kind of bothers me about Star Wars, thinking back on Star Wars. But if we have time, we'll get back to that. Or another time. Yeah. But it should have been the continuing adventures of Luke Skywalker, and not just 3 movies. It should have been like Bond movies.
Where it just kept going and going.
Where's Skywalker this time, you know? Yeah. Which was the original kind of plan. If we make enough money, we could just keep making these Skywalker movies. And then George's wife left him, and he just wanted to end the whole thing. So it became a three pitcher thing.
Well, here's my main concern with King of the Monsters, real quick, is for me.
No, keep me on track here, man. Otherwise, I'm going to hijack the whole thing.
Oh, it's fine. We're just talking, man.
Yes.
My main concern with Godzilla King of the Monsters is, for me, how do you make it any bigger? Because this movie's been teasing that they have all these titans, and you have King Ghidorah and Rodan and Mothra. I feel like Godzilla versus King Kong, for someone that's followed kaiju films as long as I have, and obviously longer with you, that's kind of a letdown in comparison to these three big monsters that are going to be in this.
Right, yeah. It's sort of like
it's just a giant ape. He's dealing with King Ghidorah here.
Right. Even though Kong is an icon, it's kind of like, okay, well, that's a little more focused. It should have been the other way around.
Right. I understand what they're doing. I mean, the Kong is the bigger icon. That's the moneymaker, but...
Yeah, I think what they wanted to do is, like, Legendary wanted to make sure to... they didn't know how long it was going to take to do these movies because, once the Gareth Edwards film came out, then there was this sort of like they pulled back and said, we're not going to make the next movie for 4 more years.
Well, yeah, they wanted to do the shared universe thing, so they made Kong Skull Island. What'd you think of that? Did you like Kong Skull Island?
Yeah. I thought it was entertaining for what it was, but it's a horrible movie. It is such a cartoon.
It is.
It has no semblance of reality whatsoever. All the actors they cast in that are sort of like they don't belong there, and they all look uncomfortable.
There were so many in that film. I don't know why they needed that many names.
Well, and it's like
not everyone has anything. Most of the people have nothing to do.
Right. They build up Tom Hiddleston, and I think they just put him in there because of him playing Loki.
Right. Brie Larson, same thing. Like, she's just the girl.
Yeah,
that takes pictures.
Right, and there was a scene. It was so ridiculous. I'm usually, the way that I grew up, I was so obsessed with movies that I would sit and watch the movies without uttering a word. Even as a small child, I was just like hypnotized, mesmerized by movies. And when people would talk, or kids, I go to a kids matinee. When I'm 8 years old at a kids matinee, it's nothing but eight-year-old average kids, whatever, kids, just full of kids. And I would hate it because I go, shut up, I'm trying to watch the movie. I wasn't throwing popcorn and running around. I was like, all y'all need to settle down. Even though I didn't do that, I was afraid to do that. I didn't want to get pummeled. But that's the way my brain worked, is I'm watching this damn movie. So I've never spoken out in a movie or vocalized anything unless of disdain. Unless, I was cheering or applauding, which didn't really become common until Star Wars.
So that's when that started happening? Because now it's super common with the big blockbusters. Right.
Well, it's come back. Mm-hmm. It came back because during the 70s, when I was growing up, most of the movies were very cynical because we were living in very cynical times. I mean, we think today's times are cynical, and they are. They're horrific. But, back then, that was the worst of all time, besides the Depression and World War II. Mm-hmm. So I'm not trying to marginalize anything, but the time that I grew up in, you had Watergate, Vietnam, you had still happening, you had energy crisis, you had a recession,
you had a lot of distrust in the government.
Yeah, we had a lot of bad things going on, man, and so a lot of movies, especially movies that were coming out of what they called the New American Cinema in the late '60s, things like Easy Rider and other pictures are very either cynical and bleak, or cynical, bleak, and nihilistic, where nobody had happy endings. Everything was dirty, scummy, and everybody died, whether your good guys were painted gray, and that's the way it was. And then Star Wars came along and was just a pure escapism of good versus bad, white hats and black hats, and that's why it became such a hit, because it was a catharsis for people of all ages. I mean, it was really a cultural phenomenon because, like I said before, by the time you get in the 70s, like all horror films, sci-fi films were made for kids. And what one critic actually wrote I'll have to track it down. But one critic said, describing a movie, reviewing a sci-fi fantasy movie, and I can't remember which one it was. He goes, this movie was made for the very young and adult, and it goes, for children, something along the lines of, this movie was made for children and retarded adults.
You said that about Star Wars?
No.
Oh.
I can't remember the pitcher.
Okay.
But that's a critic. That was the common thought. Or he said adults, are adults that think like children.
Oh man.
It was very derogatory, obviously. I think, anyway, so that was the basic prevalent thought of horror, science fiction, and fantasy films. And 20th Century Fox had no faith in Star Wars. This is a widely known story. I'm not revealing anything that people who are into Star Wars know. Don't know, rather. And they kept threatening George with cutting the production. Like, we're just going to shut you down if you're not finished. We don't care. We'll just shut you down and we'll assemble what we can, or we'll just not release the movie at all.
Jeez, what a mistake that would have been if they would have shut that down.
Yeah, and he had one guy at 20th Century Fox who was the head of 20th Century Fox. That was the only guy that was, his cheerleader, that believed in this picture. And that, kind of like kept these guys at bay until they could actually finish the movie. But anyway, so 20th Century Fox banked all their money that year. This is the same company, 20th Century Fox, that released Star Wars. They had and produced it. They had no confidence in this picture.
Mm-hmm.
They were banking. They put all their eggs in their basket. Our big science fiction hit of the year is Damnation Alley.
I've never heard of that movie.
There you go. That was like one of the biggest bombs. Like 20th Century Fox at that point in the 70s was being reorganized, and it was like on very shaky legs. And Star Wars, a movie that they hated, they didn't want made. In fact, all the other studios turned down producing Star Wars. And 20th Century Fox was the last hope to get it, and
nice,
and to produce that picture. But all the execs put all their eggs in a basket for a picture that was based on a novel, post-apocalyptic, again, the 70s, post-apocalyptic movie about survival after a nuclear holocaust. And they had built this huge tank, kind of this big giant, it was kind of like a big giant post-apocalyptic van called the Landmaster, which was where the main characters kind of trek across country. Three of the survivors, I think, and they try to cross country to find any humans that are still alive. And they cross through like flaming desert and raging seas. Like, I think the Great Lakes turn into an ocean. And they try to cross that, and there's violent storms, and there's giant scorpions and man-eating cockroaches. I'm not kidding. This is all in this picture. And, I mean, it looks like a TV movie.
What is the name of this again?
It's called Damnation Alley. And it stars frickin' George Peppard and Jan Michael Vincent.
Damnation Alley.
And Winfried from Star Trek II. I can't remember his first name now. See, my brain isn't perfect. I can't remember all his junk. Some of the names I forget.
Jean Michael Vincent?
Yeah. Jan Michael Vincent, who recently passed away. George Peppard from the A-Team, who later was in the A-Team. And basically a bunch of, other, it's a disaster picture that was a disaster. And it's not really great. It's a fun time capsule to watch it. But 20th Century Fox bet on that movie, and it flopped hard. It crashed and burned, and Star Wars turned into this huge phenomenon because you have this post-apocalyptic, very cynical. People die in it. Main characters die. Nobody's really alive at the end. Star Wars is kind of
safer.
Like, secondary heroes, third tier heroes, died. The big death is Obi-Wan, right? So,
right.
Which he wasn't originally supposed to die. He was supposed to be in the command center at Yavin. And, I think Alec Guinness wanted off the picture. He's like, I don't do anything, but I'm standing around with everybody else just looking at screens. So my character has nothing to do after this. After we leave the Death Star, I have nothing to do. said, why don't you just kill me off? It could be a powerful moment.
Well, here, let's get into this, because we got about another 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
This has been, this last week was one of the biggest weeks in terms of nerd long-form storytelling history.
Right.
Did you catch Endgame?
Yes, I did.
All right, what are your thoughts?
Oh, yes, I did. Well,
how big of a Marvel fan are you? MCU fan are you?
When I was growing up, I reached for Marvel comics. If it wasn't a horror comic, I didn't care if it was a DC, a House of Secrets or Where Monsters Dwell or Where Creatures Roam. But when I turned to superheroes, it's like I didn't even really buy Batman comics, even though I watched the Batman TV show and I watched the Batman cartoons and the Super Friends and stuff like that. But make mine Marvel, man. Gotcha, Spider-Man was my guy as a kid. And, the Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four. And then as I grew older, I really got into the new generation X-Men, with Wolverine and
Nightcrawler, Colossus, and all them.
Right. And my older cousins had like the early X-Men, the very first X-Men comics and Fantastic Four. So when I would go to their house, I would read their comics, Luckily, they trusted me not to throw them across the room or, take a crayon to them. But so I had that experience of, I think one of the first Fantastic Four comic books I remember reading was They Fight Annulus. And and that was like kind of blew my mind because the the Jack Kirby art, man, King Kirby, and it kind of just like blew me away. But yeah, so I started with Spider-Man. I watched those really terribly animated Marvel cartoons that were on TV, the very short ones that they did with the Hulk and Iron Man, and that was kind of like the gateway drug too, because those were actually, they just took comic books and cut out the panels, and just kind of made them move around a little bit, but they carried those story arcs, over from the comics, and that was kind of a really good introduction for a very small boy. And so yeah, when when Iron Man came out, I was kind of like, maybe this thing, we got the Spider-Man, that Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. Mm-hmm. I was like, they're good, they're really good. I really want to like them, but I can't completely love them. I don't hate them. I'm not going to pick them apart, but there was just something missing.
You're talking about the Raimi Spider-Man films?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. And then, I lived through all those other crappy Marvel movies before that, mm-hmm. Like the Captain America movie from Canon Films.
That never really got released? Or is that
really got released?
Or is that the Fantastic Four film? That one didn't. That's the one that didn't.
Well, that one never got
that never got released.
Yeah, that was a total write-off. That was like some weird, bizarro world nightmare that happened.
The Captain America
people.
One was where Red Skull is an Italian instead of a Nazi. Yeah, that's weird.
Right. And then and then you had like the TV stuff with Reb Brown and the Incredible Hulk TV show and the Spider-Man live-action show. And those were like, I was like, where are the villains? Where are the monsters when I was a kid? So I went, But when Iron Man came out, a friend of mine said, go check out fantasy sci-fi horror films, let's go see Iron Man. And I was just like, holy shit, they did this right,
They nailed it.
Needless to say, they spiked the landing. And, any guy and his sister could tell you the last 10 years of these MCU films. But yeah, Endgame was like, last year I was blown away. We're speechless. Obviously everybody was speechless at the end of Infinity War. I just could not really believe that they took the material that seriously. Mm-hmm. Even if we'd come so far with all these other pictures, for better or worse with some of them, usually really good. If not fantastic. And then this one just was like that ending, the last scene.
Spoiler alert if you want to say it.
Yeah, for last year's movie. We're talking about Infinity War. If you haven't seen Infinity War yet.
Yeah, you can spoil that for sure.
Yeah. So, you have like Thanos just, sitting down and looking at the sunset. It just has this, kind of like a little, not a smirk, but he has a
content
sense of contentment on his face, and that was just like,
that's a hell of an ending, a ballsy ending.
Holy shit, holy shit, they're getting into some, they're getting in some Kurosawa Seven Samurai, stuff right here with ending the film on that kind of a note. And then Endgame. Holy crap. I mean, that is like, that whole film is holy shit.
It is.
And I've been reading a couple comments from just, fans, talking about, what they thought. And, there's always those guys that come out and go, well, it was good, but it wasn't that great. I mean, I could just pick it apart all day.
Right.
And I go, those are the people that just want to pick apart everything, or they have their agenda of, I'm a DC guy, I don't like Marvel, so I'm going to try to pick this apart as much as possible. Or they have just expectations that are beyond what anybody could do.
Right.
And if their expectations were met, or they could make the movie that they envision in their head, it would probably be a horrendous affair. They would probably drool all over it all day, because that's what you do with your own creation, whether it's,
good or
dead
bad
on delivery, or it's an Adonis, it's like, you're just going to drool on it. But yeah, Endgame was just, man, I had fleeting thoughts before the movie, while waiting for this movie to be finished and released, how are they going to work that out? Well, maybe they're going to do this. I know they're going to do something with the quantum realm.
Mm-hmm.
They've set that up. It's obvious. A child could have figured that out, that they're going to do something with the quantum realm. But what are they going to do is the important thing. And they hit these notes, turned them around, made them more complex, explained it, worked that out, and tied everything in a bow. And at the same time, there are things that are left at the end of the movie where it's not. When people say it's a plot hole, they don't know what they're talking about, because they're not really talking about a plot hole. They're talking about a untied knot that is probably left untied for future film.
Right. This isn't over. I mean, this is the end of this saga, but they're still going to make more MCU films. So.
Oh yeah, this is the end of this iteration of the Avengers,
right.
Obviously. So, we're gonna move on from here, but I mean, they just basically, entertained the hell out of me. I went in there going like, it's kind of weird. Some of the things I've said, and I've been watching a lot more Kevin Smith lately, just talking about movies and things he likes, and going like, wow, this guy and I are kind of like, we've got a simpatico thing going on here, because, he goes, I go to these movies and people tell me that I'm just a blow in Marvel, and, just because I work in the industry and all that. It's like, no, I like these movies because I like them. That's what I grew up on. I'm a fan. That's why I just sit in the theater. I just go to the theater and say, entertain me, tell me a story. Mm-hmm. He goes, I don't care about what expectations did me. I go in going like, I don't know what's going to happen. You tell me the story.
Right.
And that's pretty much my thought, is like, I want to go in there and you tell me a story.
Yeah, I think it's dangerous when you go in there with your own expectations of how the story should go, because then it's impossible. It's never going to meet your expectation of a story.
Yeah. And are your expectations really, do they hold any water?
Right. Is that an actual good story?
Yeah. That's the thing. And, the same thing with, let's wrap this up with or come full circle with King of the Monsters. So before Endgame, I saw trailers, and, the King, there was like the Fast and Furious presents
Hobbs and Shaw.
Yeah. We're going to punch each other out for 2 hours.
Yeah. Just a big punchy movie.
Big punchy movie with super ridiculous. They're doing superhero crap, and they're supposed to be mortal humans.
Yep.
But it looks funny. And if it's anything like Cash and Tango,
oh yeah,
maybe it'll be fun.
Right.
It's going to be ridiculous. Sometimes you can't go too over the top where it's just like, oh my God. And sometimes it's funny. It's a counterpoint, but it all depends on how it's executed, right?
Right.
But so, there's that, and, that got a couple chuckles out of me. I usually watch trailers and go, or go, pass, And there were a couple of those, and then they got to King of the Monsters. And I hadn't seen the final trailer, because just didn't want to look at it. I had no interest in seeing it online. And I went really somewhere over the rainbow.
Yeah, somewhere over the rainbow, yes.
Really? I went, that's an odd choice. Okay. I don't get the context. Maybe it'll figure in the movie, but this is just a trailer.
Yeah.
Trailer doesn't mean anything. It's just the sales pitch.
Right.
For the movie. That's all trailers are. Some people like rate trailers and they get all wound up. That trailer sucked. It's like, it doesn't matter. It's just a piece of advertising. That's all it is. It's not the movie. People now critique them as like seriously as they critique pictures, the whole motion picture. And that's just, frankly, kind of sad. But anyway, so I see it and it really didn't evoke an emotion out of me. And when they said Ghidorah, they dropped Ghidorah's name, they dropped Godzilla's name, and I kind of cringed when Godzilla's name was dropped.
They dropped it kind of weird because one guy goes like, "Oh God," and the other guy goes, "Zilla."
Yeah,
and that's how they dropped it.
Yeah, there was what's the actress's name from Miga? I know I'm screwing her whole name up. She was in Bates Motel TV show. That's in it. But anyway, she says, we have to find Godzilla.
Yeah, we have to.
And I just went. It sounded like a line from like. It immediately made me think of it. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. It reminded me of the Mattel TV commercial from 1978 with the Godzilla Shogun Warrior. Go get him, Godzilla! It was just kind of like it's like the delivery of somebody who's dubbing an anime. We're in a cartoon.
Yeah, that's
it's like, well, that's not how the Japanese actors do it, but they're kind of taking the whole thing straight. But you're going like, I can't separate acting from cartoon, even though this is like people are being raped and murdered in this anime. I'm in a cartoon, so it was kind of jarring, and I just kind of went, eh. So the trailer. And they had the Men in Black trailer, and I was just like, nah, I don't know how I feel about that, but, hey, it's got Hemsworth.
Yeah, I wasn't all in that.
It's just kind of like, I might go see it if somebody says it's really funny.
Right.
If not, I'll see it on cable. I like Hemsworth. He's funny. He's naturally funny.
He is very funny.
But anyway, so then they got to The Last Jedi. I mean, not The Last Jedi. God, that was last year. they got to
Rise of Skywalker. What is it called?
Yeah, The Rise of Skywalker.
Rise of Skywalker. Yeah.
They got to that trailer, and all the feels happened.
Yeah, that was good for you.
All the feels happened, and I'm known as the Godzilla guy, and the Godzilla trailer didn't do a thing for me. And frankly, after watching Game of Thrones last night, I thought the dragon stuff in last night's episode of GOT. Was better than anything I saw in the Godzilla trailer.
They did a really good job with the dragon stuff. That was amazing, especially for TV. That was unbelievable.
Well, they went above the clouds and all that, with the moon framed in there and the moon lighting the top of the clouds.
Even with the dragons fighting and then the evil dragon, the White Walker dragon having his face cut off and he's still spitting out fire through that broken part of his face was awesome.
But I mean, just those shots where they're they flew up above the clouds and they don't know where the zombie dragon is.
Yep.
The dead dragon, and they're just kind of like they kind of hover for a second before they dive back down in the clouds. I was like, wow, I know that looked better than any of the monster footage I saw in the Godzilla King of the Monsters trailer. Now I know that's just one brief scene, and I haven't seen the movie yet. But I've just said, that's why I said what I saw in the trailer. Mm-hmm. Because I don't know what, you don't know what's been tweaked, what's not going to be in the finished film, how much they're going to change it for the finished film, et cetera, et cetera. So that'll have to be judged, on its own thing.
Mm-hmm.
So the only thing I hope for any of these movies, I don't care if they keep making these American Godzilla pictures or not, and they want to have all these crazy monster scenes, that's fine. What I care about is story. What I care about is the quality of the writing And, hopefully you get decent actors and a decent director, and a director that can handle actors. Because there's some actors that are great when they have a good director.
Yeah, and
there's other actors who can walk on set and not leave a dry eye in the house.
Yeah,
no matter who's behind the camera.
A lot of directors just can't act or can't direct actors. They can shoot beautiful things, but
that was the problem with Skull Island. Is that the director of that film? I don't know him personally. He might be a great guy. A couple people I know have, had conversations with him and palled around with him a little bit. But, it's like he is a guy that knows how to, he's cutting action scenes and he's doing stuff with the camera.
He captured Vietnam and that feel of...
He did nothing with the actors. And the music was so forced. It was kind of ridiculous. Oh, and one thing I wanted to touch on, I had a thing about Skull Island where it got to a point where I was saying I was always been respectful in theaters watching movies, even if I was seeing something like Count Yorga Vampire, watching some low budget vampire film, I would just watch it like I would watch, Dr. Strangelove, you just sit there and just get into the tell me the story. I'm going to go with you. And at the end, I'll go, that was all right. Or that was great, And so at Skull Island, it got to a point where my two friends I went with, Omar and Marcus, we were kind of groaning at things and we were laughing and we were having a good time. We were having a good time with the movie. Not at the movie, but with the movie. But it got to the one point where Samuel L. Jackson has his standoff with Kong, and at night and he's holding the torch.
Oh, yeah, he's like,
you remember that?
Yeah, he's
remember
like glaring at, I forget what he says.
Yeah, he goes, "Come and get me, you mother effing gorilla," or whatever.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Whatever he says. I don't remember. I saw it once. I only saw the movie once. That was enough. I saw it in a theater. Don't need to see it again. Not because I hated it, not because I thought it was terrible. It's I don't feel the need. Then that movie did not make me want to revisit it. I saw it. So we're done. Right. No offense to Skull Island. And I know a guy who I bought 4 copies on DVD or Blu-ray or whatever. I'm like, okay, he's saving for the apocalypse. Hope there's electricity to watch those. So Samuel L. Jackson is facing off, and he's got the torch, and he's yelling at Kong, and Kong staring at him. When Samuel L. Jackson raises, and I hadn't seen this movie before. This is my first viewing of the movie. We're seeing it in the afternoon. We got our popcorn. We're not drunk. We're not stoned. We're just on ices. We're on a sugar high and sodium and fake butter and popcorn. And Samuel L. Jackson raises his torch, and I went, "Come on! I'm here! Kill me! Kill me! I'm here!"
Predator, Arnold Schwarzenegger style.
Yeah.
Well,
I was like, this director is now, he's referencing Predator.
At this point, he's just letting the actors do whatever the hell they want.
Right, yeah. Right. And, and even Sam Jackson he just walked through that movie, He just was Sam Jackson. All going like, we got a paycheck, we got a paycheck and a trip to Vietnam.
Right.
Awesome. Cool. And Hawaii. They shot in Hawaii too, right? So, so you got that there. And then, contrast that with, Sam Jackson in Captain Marvel, where, if he wasn't in that movie, it would have been felt missed.
Right.
If he wasn't in that movie, because every time he's on screen, he's just like, he's on it. He's on this game. He wanted to be in that movie. He's having a good time. But I don't think they were really, they're going, this is the big gorilla picture. We don't care. It's just kind of sad, but that's the way things go.
Well, August, I'd love to keep this going, but it's 1:00 in the morning where I'm at.
Right.
So, we'll definitely hook up again. But is there anything you want to plug for the audience before you go? Any websites, any books, anything?
I'll be looking for a job. If anybody's hiring.
Nice.
Anybody wants to hire me to talk their ear off and put them to sleep, I can do that.
Well, here, I'll plug this for you. I bought the book E.G. Tsuburaya, Master of Monsters, and I read it, and it's great. So
thank you, man.
So if people are into the behind the scenes look into kaiju filmmaking and just sci-fi monster movie filmmaking, E.G. Tsuburaya was one of the greats, and August did a great job.
Yeah, he's the guy who was he was the Willis O'Brien of Japan and the Ray Harryhausen, the George Pal kind of all wrapped up into one. He's the guy that created that whole Japanese special effects techniques of the miniature cities and the guys in the monster suits, and he was a film innovator and a cinematographer, and became the master of monsters. And he died in 1970, but he left a legacy that's still going on now, because Godzilla King of the Monsters opens next month.
Exactly.
And if it weren't for Eiji Tsuburaya, who brought Godzilla to life in 1954 physically, we wouldn't be talking tonight. We wouldn't be going to see this picture.
100%. All right, August. Thanks, man.
Thank you.